How do you like your rocks in the morning? I like mine made of plaster, tinfoil, wool filler, PVA glue, and a little bit of paint. Oh, hello friends, hope you're well. In today's video I'm going to show you how to whip up some rock faces like the ones I've shown here. I briefly ran through this in the Cadian diorama I'd made a while ago, but I wanted to go through it in a bit more detail for those who are interested. And I think you will be very surprised to learn how cheap, easy and quick it is to get your rocks off, so let's do it. Now, to make these lovely rock faces, all you're going to need is some plaster of Paris, tin foil, wall filler, paint and PVA glue. That's it. Super simple and really cheap components. You can probably pick up all this stuff for around £10 or so if you don't have it already. First off, we're going to use the tin foil to make a mould for our rocks. So I first fold over a sheet 3 or 4 times until it's feeling a bit more rigid. Then I give it a thorough scrunching all over, and it's this scrunching which is going to give us a nice craggy, rocky texture, so don't be shy. You can be fairly deliberate with this stage, choosing to scrunch it up more if you want a nice fine grain to the rock, or scrunching it less if you want some larger chunks of rock with less cragginess. And with your tin foil suitably scrunched to your preference, just fold up the sides into a tray like this so it can receive the plaster without leaking out. Easy peasy. I'll be making 3 batches today, each a little more or less craggy than the last, just to give me a bit of rock diversity to choose from. For our next step, equip your fanciest pink marigolds, then take your plaster and mix in a good amount of water. I prefer to go a little wetter for this as it helps when slopping it into the moulds, but you can see how fast it begins to set as it's already starting to firm up as I pour it out. Generally speaking, I like to slosh it into the mould as thinly as possible as it makes breaking up the rocks easier, uses less plaster, and also means our dioramas won't be unnecessarily heavy when finished. This mixture, however, has ended up pretty damn thick as it was starting to set and I had to slosh it all in a wild frenzy before it hardened. So they're going to come out a lot thicker than I normally like, but they'll still work fine, so don't worry if yours are a bit on the chonky side either. Your plaster will need time to dry fully, which will depend on how thickly you poured them, but leaving them overnight should be more than enough, even for these chunkers. Once dry, I'll peel them out of their moulds, and you can see that they are looking distinctively rock-like. You can go ahead and save this tin foil to reuse in future if you want, just scrunch it all up again into a mould and you're good to go. But yeah, these look good as they are. You could potentially use a whole rock face like this, but I prefer to smash them up into smaller rock sections, which I'll use to build up some rock faces in more natural formations. And as I pulverize them, you can see how thick this batch is. For your own ones, try to make them a bit thinner if possible. As I said, these ones will still work fine, I'll just have to do a bit more blending in with our wall filler than I would if they were thinner. Now, I've whipped up these quick random bases from some leftover foam to show you how you might go about constructing rock faces. It's good to try and line up the pieces before you stick them down, but since I'm not too fussed about how these come out, as they're just for demonstration, I'll start whacking down some rocks. Usually I'd use some no-nails mastic stuff here, which dries rock hard. But today I'm just using my hot glue gun to stick them down quickly. This stage can be really fun as you can build up little rock shelves or crevices and other rocky formations depending on where you place your pieces of rock. So have fun here and feel free to look at some images or videos of rock formations to see how you could build these up in a more realistic looking way. And you might find they look a bit random at the moment, like a bunch of unconnected weird rock-like things instead of a unified rock face. But once we blend these together with our wall filler, they'll look a lot better and a lot more natural. So let's do that now. Right, take some filler on your finger or some kind of small spreading utensil and just start feeding it into these gaps. I like to use my finger to smooth it over once it's in the gaps, just to make things a bit quicker and easier. And I tend to wear gloves if I'm doing this, just because it can be quite harsh on your skin if you're doing a lot of it. But the gloves can also get in the way a bit sometimes, so it can be easier just to raw dog it. I'll leave that decision up to you. Also, don't worry too much if you get some overspill onto the rocks. You can scrape it off easily or just leave it on, as when it dries it will still have a rough and rocky texture, so you won't really see it in the end. You'll notice as you do this, the rocks start to look like one big formation instead of random little segments. And once you're happy that all the gaps have been filled and the rock pieces brought together in a holy matrimony of rock face unity, you are ready to start painting. Which is the best bit, so enjoy it. Woohoo! So my first coat will actually be a mixture of PVA glue and paint together. This is going to seal everything in, which is especially important with plaster and filler, as it can have quite a chalky, dusty surface once it dries. Sealing it in like this means that when we start painting in a moment, none of that dust will get into our paint, and also it helps to make the piece a bit more durable overall. Give that a good amount of time to dry, maybe a few hours or so, and it'll be ready to receive your rocky colours. So the painting process for these is actually really simple, but can result in some really realistic looking rock formations if you don't overdo it. I'll demonstrate a kind of traditional grey rock face here using this big old lamp, and start by mixing together some cheap black and white craft paints to make a dark grey undercoat. These cheap craft paints are more than good enough for painting rocks and dioramas, and you can usually pick them up for a couple of quid each. I might leave some black showing in the deepest crevices, but I'm going for a good solid coverage with the first coat. After that, it's just a question of gradually mixing in some white to make the paint lighter and applying it in smaller amounts. For these subsequent coats, I wipe off a lot of the excess paint into some tissue so I have better control of my brush, and apply it in a semi-dry brushing sort of way. Each time I lighten the mixture, I apply it to a smaller surface area on the rocks than the last coat, and I focus on adding the lighter paint to the raised parts of the rocks, and I'm careful not to get any into the crevices or areas I want to keep dark. Following this, your final lightest coat, which in this case for my grey rock face will be an almost pure white highlight, is added to just the very tips and edges of the rocks. You can use this same principle for painting all kinds of different rock schemes, maybe a desert one like this, or a pretty wacky looking sci-fi or fantasy rock face like this. Just apply your darker base coat, then dry brush on subsequent layers of lighter and lighter paint to a smaller and smaller surface area of the rocks, focusing the lighter coats to the edges and tips of the rocks and being careful not to get them into any dark crevices. And with that, our rock face here is already looking pretty good. You could leave it like this if you're in a rush. Not really sure why you'd be making a rock face in any kind of extreme time crunch, but to elevate it to that next level, we're going to apply some different coloured washes. So for my traditional rock face here, I normally use 4 different washes: black, brown, green and ochre, which I make by mixing a small dollop of craft paint with a splash of water. I'll slap these on fairly randomly across the rocks, and I don't want to cover the whole face with all of them, as you wouldn't find an equal distribution of colours across rocks in nature. So I dab my brush here and there, letting the wash flow down into the cracks and crevices, and then I come in with some tissue just to wick away any excess wash. I want to apply just enough to give the rocks a nice coloured hue, but not saturate them with colour, since this would look unnatural. Make sure to let each wash dry before you add your next one, otherwise they'll just blend together into a dirty mess. I've made that mistake before quite a lot of times, but I like to use a hairdryer to speed up the process so you don't have to sit around and wait for it to dry, because that is as boring as watching paint dry. It's best to apply these washes from dark to light, so the lighter washes are not obscured by the darker ones and give the impression of surface flora. So I'll apply the black first to reinforce the shadows, brown to begin adding some dusty, dirty hues, then the green to give the suggestion of moss or some other kind of micro plant life, and finally some ochre, which I use mainly around the previous green areas just to add a bit of coloured variation. Since rocks are natural formations, they're never just one colour like grey with lighter grey, so experiment around with adding different coloured washes to give your rocks natural looking hues. For these desert rocks, I used a couple of different brown washes and also an ochre wash, to start adding to that natural colour diversity. And for my fantasy sci-fi rocks here, I've used black wash first, followed by a red one, and finally a purple one, which I think gives it a nice varied effect. These washes can make or break your rock faces, so don't over apply them. Wipe off any excess wash, allow them to dry thoroughly between coats, and experiment with different colours to find the ones that suit whatever you're creating. Once your washes have all dried off, the final step is to just gently reapply some of those highlights through dry brushing to bring a bit of brightness back into the rocks. I'll typically use the 2 final brightest paint mixtures I used previously and apply these very sparingly. I'm just trying to pick out those edges and tips again without obscuring the coloured hues we've brought in with our washes. And that is that, my friends. Our rocks are finished. Now you can go ahead, add in any extras like flock or mud or moss or whatever you like. With these techniques, you can create whatever rock face you want with surprisingly little effort. If I exclude drying times, I've probably only spent about an hour or so creating each of these little mock-up examples here, which is pretty wild if you ask me. You can be more methodical than I've been and really take your time to make these look even more realistic. But even if you just speed through it like I have today, you can end up with some really cool, realistic looking rock faces. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, for around £10 or so, you can buy enough plaster, paint and PVA to make kilograms of these rocks. And I hope you'll also see how effective tin foil molds can be, especially when you consider those silicone molds from Woodland Scenics and other places cost around £10 to £15 and produce the same 5 or so rocks every time you use them. A roll of tin foil is, a couple of quid and gives you the potential to make an endless amount of different rocks. So yeah, rocks baby, woo! Thanks for watching if you've made it to this point, and please feel free to subscribe if you've enjoyed this video or learned anything or want to see more stuff like this in the future. And also leave a comment if there's any other techniques you'd like to see, or if you just want to say hello or say you hate me and my rocks, whatever. Leave a comment, subscribe, tell your dog you love it, and stick around for future content. This has been another production by a rat living in a swamp, and I will see you very soon. See ya!